All right, so Steve, why don't you introduce yourself and we can get started.
Sure. My name is Steve Mintz. I'm a professor of accounting here at Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo, and in the Orfalea College of Business. And my field of specialty is ethics.
Okay, shall we dive in?
Let's dive in.
Okay, so we're going to talk about ethics today. So we're all on the same page. How would you define ethics in a business context?
Well, I think first we have to say that ethics is ethics. In other words, there are certain standards of behavior that people should aspire to achieve. We tend to say in ethics it's prescriptive. It's how you should act. It doesn't describe how people necessarily act. And in business, it's ethics applied to business contexts. So there are certain standards of behavior that are pretty much acceptable in all realms of society, such as honesty, integrity, trust, accountability, respect, responsibility, fair treatment. And what business ethics should be is the application of those standards to business-specific situations.
All right, so let's set the scene. What has changed about business ethics in the last decade, and where are we today?
Well, there have been a lot of events that have occurred on a national, systemic level that have changed, I think, the quality of business ethics. On the one hand, business has become global. So you've got a lot of cultural issues. Not every country has the same set of cultural standards as we might have here in the United States. I think a good example is with bribery. In some countries, bribery is an accepted way of doing business. In the US, we have certain boundaries that can't be passed. And when you pass them, you've violated the law. There are a lot of events that have occurred from an economic financial point of view that I think has sort of infiltrated business ethics. For example, back in 1999, Bill Clinton signed into law a repeal of what's known as the Glass-Steagall Act. And a lot of people point to that as the cause of the financial recession, which was clearly a lack of ethics. But basically, the financial services industry used to be separated. There was a wall up between commercial banks and investment banks. So one couldn't do the other. And Glass-Steagall was that wall. With the repeal of the act, all of a sudden you had companies like Citibank becoming Citigroup, because they not only did commercial banking, they did investment banking. They even purchased Travelers Insurance Company. And what happened was, as the economy heated up in the 1990s, which in part led to the repeal of Glass-Steagall, investment banks started to make loans to homeowners, and the actual loan would be made by the bank, Citibank, for example. Then Citibank would take all these loans and package them into an investment. They call that a structured investment. And that would be sold off to the investment branch. So what's happening is the loans that were made were oftentimes based on very poor credit ratings and other loosened standards that had occurred over time. And now the investment bank looks for outside investors to buy these packages. So you're having the risk transferred from one group to another group, ultimately to the unsuspecting public that doesn't know these loans are really not backed by very much. And what happened was, when the economy started to have problems in the early 2000s, a lot of people could not pay off these loans, and the investors, the public, were left holding basically worthless debt. That ushered in an era of lack of ethics. I think that was one of the big things that occurred. In my field, accounting, it was basically a lot of greed that went on, largely associated with the telecommunications industry. There used to be very strict regulation of telecommunications. That also was ultimately chipped away from. And what happened was, in the 1990s, telecom boomed. Everybody wanted to be connected to the internet. So you had all these telecom companies wanting to grow by leaps and bounds, be competitive. They'd buy up smaller companies. And a lot of pressure started to exist from a financial point of view to make the profits look a lot bigger than it really was. And there's a lot of pressure and greed, and all of a sudden games were played with the financial statements. And these two activities basically led to the financial recession. And I think that was a game changer in ethics. We're still trying to recover, I think, our ethical standing from those two activities.
Absolutely. And there are other national and international issues recently that have kind of fueled the ethics debate. Things like VW, that's obviously been a huge scandal in the news lately. How has that kind of shifted the conversation?
Well, VW, I think, is sort of a unique thing. You don't find too many companies, car companies or otherwise, actually designing a system to put out false data to cheat the emission standards. Automobile industry has had its problems over time. Just about every company has had massive recalls, situations where they actually knew about these defects or problems, internal reports ignored. Basically, companies from an ethical point of view, they seem to make the same mistake, especially in the auto industry. They do a cost-benefit analysis. What's going to cost me to do the right thing, to fix the problem? What are the benefits of doing that? And they decide it costs too much. They'll take their chances. So that's not a very sound ethical way because of the fact that people have certain rights, such as the public, to drive a safe car. So that the VW, I think, is a one-off type situation, although the auto industry is not. You have other activities such as just yesterday, Pfizer, mega pharmaceutical company, announced it's buying Allergan, which is an Irish company. Allergan, basically, its claim to fame is Botox. It manufactures Botox. But in the acquisition, they're moving their headquarters to Ireland. Now, you might wonder, Pfizer, mega company, Fortune 500, buying smaller Allergan, Irish company, moving to Ireland. Well, again, a lot of this is greed because once you move your headquarters to another country, that's where you pay your corporate taxes. So the corporate tax rate in Ireland is 12.5%. Corporate tax rate in the US is 35%. So there are all these events that are really economic based that are creating ethical challenges for companies.
Mm-hmm. And as the public, it's hard to have a conversation about maybe positive ethical examples because it seems like the only time we get to talk about it is when something goes wrong. Right. Do you feel like we have any ethical role models in business or otherwise that we can look up to kind of set this standard in a positive way?
I think there are. One company that always sticks out in my mind is Whole Foods. They have an excellent reputation for ethics. Their CEO is really committed to it, and they have specific corporate social responsibility type programs to back that up. But I think most of the companies, unfortunately, are paying lip service to ethics. They have nice documents, call them ethics codes, file them, but it doesn't become part of the culture. That's the problem. You can have something on a sheet of paper, but unless you act that way and set an ethical tone, we call it a tone at the top, it doesn't work really well. But we do have more and more companies that are looking at the corporate social responsibility side of ethics, which seems to have caught on a lot, not only with the public, but I think younger people today.
Right, and there are companies that are choosing to structure themselves as a B Corp or paying more attention to triple bottom line to have these other values really infused in everything that they do, not necessarily, one day a year or just having a specific document that's filed away. Do you think that indicates a positive trend for businesses, or it like you're saying, is that more about their brand and how they're perceived publicly?
Well, the thing I fear with B Corps, as well as not so much the triple bottom line. The triple bottom line's been around for quite a while and is well established. I think B Corps is about 4 years old. Mm-hmm. And I'm a little concerned that companies are using it as a PR piece to say they are B Lab certified because they've met certain standards. And I know a little bit about this, and it costs somewhere between $500,000 and $50,000 to become certified. So you have to pay money to B-Lab for them to do their due diligence to check out all your social, environmental, employment, corporate governance policies. And one of the stories I read about this recently, they said that the biggest benefit of being B-Lab certified is the other companies in the membership group give discounts to members. So now you're getting discounts on products for being a member of the group. So I'm a little bit concerned about the whole idea of B Corp. Maybe it needs to evolve over time. But Triple Bottom Line, I think, really has some sound practices where performance is measured not only financially, but it's based on environmental policies, social policies, ecological policies, people, planet, profits, is what they say. And that has caught on a lot. I know my students are seemingly very interested in that.
Now, we're in kind of an era where technology has really driven where business is going in a lot of ways. Has technology helped or hurt a decision maker's ability to be ethical? Or do you think it's changed the conversation about what transparency a consumer can expect?
Well, I think the question really is whether people can keep up with the technology. My fear there is those who know the technology best can use it, especially if they're motivated to do something unethical. This happens in accounting, where auditors may not be as familiar with the technology of companies as those that run the tech service. So I think we have a lot to catch up there, and we need to have more and more training and education, especially in colleges, about how technology could be used, both for good and bad. But it's an evolving field for sure.
All right, let me move down a little bit more. So you talked a little bit about the globalization of brands. Can you comment a little bit more about how international brands can try to govern themselves ethically, knowing they're covering so much ground, so many different cultures, so many different geographic locations?
Well, I think it's through the policies, some of which we mentioned, through sound corporate governance policies. There are a lot of laws now that were passed in the aftermath of frauds like Enron and WorldCom. In the U.S., we have the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and there are very stiff corporate governance laws which kind of set standards. Overseas, they're sometimes even stronger than they are in the U.S. There are all these organizations, such as the Triple Bottom Line. There's one called the Global Reporting Initiative. We talked about B Corp. So there are a lot of organizations that are setting up metrics to measure performance in non-financial areas. And this is catching on in different ways. So I think corporations have a way of measuring their success. More and more are buying into that. I think you're going to see it grow over time. I think young people, the millennial generation, is much more interested. They're not just looking to work for companies that are profitable, but that they're doing good things, improving the environment. So I'm pretty encouraged about that part of it.
That's great. You mentioned companies like Enron, which had kind of mythical fallout after a particular whistleblower or something came to light. And we talked about this before, the legislation that tends to protect whistleblowers and having that be weaved into someone's personal ethical values. Can you comment at all about how that's evolved even now, even some recent kind of whistleblowers that have come to light? How has that influenced the conversation about ethics?
Well, whistleblowing has become more acceptable. It used to be pretty much a stigma, and the whistleblower was retaliated against almost uniformly, maybe demoted, fired. Now there are protections in place, laws that are in place. One of the major laws Congress passed is the Dodd-Frank Financial Reform Act. So again, in my field is always on the front lines because the accountants are the keepers of the numbers, keepers of the books. You now have situations where if an accounting employee has, first of all, done all he or she should do to bring the matter up the chain of command within the organization to no avail, can in fact go to the regulators, blow the whistle, and even somewhat controversially get an award for blowing the whistle. So in financial matters and accounting matters, the award can be 10 to 30% of a lawsuit gained by the regulator, which would be the Securities Exchange Commission. It has to be in excess of $1 million. Now, does that promote people to whistleblow? Are more employees gathering data on their companies with the intention, I've got some stuff on them to blow the whistle down the line? I hope not. But there is some concern about that, perhaps not so much with accounting, but in general. But I think whistleblowing is a game changer because of the stigma and the laws that are passed and studies that have been done that this is the best way to stop fraud.
Mm-hmm. Now, we're talking kind of conceptually. This is all about the prescriptive practice of being ethical. When it comes down to what actually happens when you're the one with the pressure on and, you need to make your report to the board, or your supervisor is expecting good news at your next meeting, it's a whole different story. Can you talk about how you try to instill these values and even practice making these ethical decisions with students in the classroom?
The thing I try to do is to get them to feel what it would be like to be in the situation of someone who is considering whistleblowing, who has the ethical dilemma. Traditionally, ethics education has focused mostly on philosophical reasoning because it is a tried and true way of getting students to gain judgment, ethical judgment. There are certain prescribed methods, and we teach them that. We tell them sort of how to use them. But what I found over time is a couple of things. One, students get tired of doing the ethical analysis case after case after case. I call it ethics fatigue. And they don't really relate to it. They still have trouble seeing, gee, I'm in this company, they're doing something wrong, I'm being told to be quiet. I'm thinking about the philosophy of it, but I'm also quite aware of the fact I may lose my job. I may not be able to support my family. So how do we get them to feel the fact that if you do go along with something like this, the long-term consequences could be much more severe than just losing your job? So one of the new techniques that has evolved the last 10 years or so is it's a method called giving voice to values. We first try to get students to be aware of what are good corporate ethical values, some of the things I mentioned earlier on. And once we get them to realize these are ethical ways to behave, we put them into situations. It's sort of role-playing. And we give them a case scenario, have them act it out, so they really get to feel the pressure of maybe one of the other students telling them, no, you can't do this, you can't say this, you'll be fired. And they tend to relate to it a little bit better, I think. Scripting, role play, rather than direct lecturing and discussion, seems to go a little bit further in getting students to buy into the importance of being ethical. Mm-hmm. But it's not easy.
Mm-hmm. And it's appreciating it on a personal basis, that when it comes down to it, these big scandals, these big things that have gone down with major legislation, it comes down to the decisions of individuals.
Right.
Yeah. Let's see. You talked about kind of being inspired by your students and having some hope for their ethical direction going forward. Where do you see kind of ethics going in business in the future? Is there kind of a frontier that we haven't gotten to yet, or a trend that we're coming up on here?
Yeah, I think the key is the cultural differences, that we have to bridge that gap. Every country has their own culture, and standards will be different. And I don't think multinationals have really dealt with that. Maybe this is part of VW's issue. I remember just a couple of weeks ago, I read that VW is, I think they're trying to stop the bleeding, basically, reputation-wise, and the loss of money, because people are reluctant to buy VW cars. So they instituted a program that through November 30th, any employee who comes forward with negative information about the so-called defeat device that they put into their cars will not be retaliated against or treated badly by the company. But it's got to be by November 30th. Now that says a lot about the culture. I guess the culture in VW is you don't go against the company. But we'll give you until November 30th to go against the company. After that, all bets are off. I mean, this just doesn't make any sense. And how do you mesh the cultures? It's not easy.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Let's see. In terms of your own research and what you've uncovered, is there any particular research that you're on today that is really getting you excited about what's to come?
Yes. You mentioned whistleblowing. This is an area of research I'm working on now. I'm trying to define different models of whistleblowing so that companies can really say, these are the things we sort of need to do to foster whistleblowing. In other words, get them to buy into it, just like they've bought into corporate social responsibility, environmental, that whistleblowing is a good thing, but convince them through an ethical, moral point of view. And it goes against the grain in many respects because profit is always so high and things like being ethical, businesses still are not convinced that good ethics is good business. I always try to tell my students, first of all, that's not the best way to look at it because you shouldn't say you should be ethical in business because somehow you're going to improve the bottom line. You may or may not. But being ethical is important to do the right thing and to set a positive tone, contribute to a society. So I'm working on research that would define a model to help businesses develop more of an ethical culture, which would incorporate whistleblowing.
That's great. Now, from your personal perspective, you talked about having leadership at the top really buy into ethics. Do you think that, the next generation can bring ethics from the bottom up, from, some of the lower level positions all the way to the top, or does it really have to start top down?
I think young people will have more to say over time with the ethics of their companies. I don't know if that's a social media phenomenon. And it's not that unusual for young people to go to social media and post things of a negative sense about their companies. The companies may not like it, but we do have freedom of speech, and we could say whatever we want after work hours, as long as it is done in a tactful way. I think that's the key. But I think companies are becoming aware of the fact that what they do becomes instant knowledge. Years ago, it didn't work that way. So they're being more careful. I think they're being more ethical. They're being more concerned about it. And I do see young people having a positive effect in that regard. It's going to take time to change a culture that, especially during the last 10 and 20 years, as I've mentioned, has been driven so much by profits. But I do see good signs with respect to the current group of graduates, the current students I'm teaching, certainly.
That's great.
Yeah.
As a result of all of these big scandals, we'll finish on, what do you think are the big lessons learned here? Do you think these industries have really learned their lesson when it comes to regulating some of their unethical practices themselves or from a government perspective?
I think a government perspective, yes. You do have a lot of laws and requirements now, and it doesn't really sit with me well, but laws to make you ethical, to me that's counterintuitive. If you need a law to make a person or a company ethical, it's probably not going to have its desired effect. But the fact is there are laws which, if you do violate ethics, you're going to get into trouble. But the one mistake I see companies still making is they equate being ethical with being legal. As long as they follow the laws, they're ethical. Well, that's not always the case because the laws can't cover every situation, so you have to have the ethical standards. But I do see more attention. Years ago, you might say 50% of the companies had codes of ethics or ethics training, or an ethics hotline, or an ethics officer. I'd say 80% of the companies now have all of those things. And I think hotlines have really become very important. The anonymous reporting of an incident where you don't have to give your name, but that person on the other end of the line is going to investigate that matter, has really had a very, very positive effect on the ethical culture of companies. So I think these things work in cycles, And I think we're on the way of going back up. And I'm pretty confident things will be a lot better in the next 10 years.
Good. Well, is there anything we didn't cover? Is there anything we want to add before we turn off the cameras here?
Well, I think the thing that I see missing the most in society, which affects not only society but business, is a lack of role models. Years ago, there were lots of role models. We used to think of our politicians as role models. Somewhat unbelievable to think of that today, given their rating with respect to integrity and respect, but nevertheless, they were role models. Parents were role models, teachers were role models, people who served as firefighters, policemen and policewomen. And I think that we've lost sight of the importance of role models. And I think the society has to pay more attention to this. We always hear the negative stories. As a side point, one of the things I really like about CNN, they have this program at the end of every year called Their Heroes. And they'll have 10 stories of 10 people that made a difference in the community. They'll give out awards. It's really grown quite a bit. And I think that's the kind of thing. We need the media. We need folks to pay more attention and to report the good things that are going on out there, because there are many, including in corporate America. And that's a good start, I believe.
Great. Well, thank you so much for talking to us today. It was a pleasure to sit down with you.
Thank you for having me.
We're certainly lucky to have you here.
Thank you.